No one dared go near his camp for years, until a lost bride caught into his campfire trap by accident. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let's dive into the story. The land was vast, unforgiving, and silent. For years, no one dared to venture near his camp, not because of superstition, but because the people knew what he was capable of. His name was Turok, and he had chosen isolation long ago, leaving behind the world that had never accepted him. Half Comanche, half white, he had found solace in the wilderness of the high plains, away from both the hostility of the settlers and the betrayal of his own people. His camp was hidden deep in the hills, surrounded by rugged terrain and thick forests. The few who had tried to approach had never returned, their fates sealed by the traps he had set with deadly precision. For years, he had lived in peace, unbothered by the outside world. He had his campfire, his solitude, and his thoughts. Life was simple, yet bitterly lonely. But everything changed on that cold autumn evening. It was a time of year when the winds howled through the trees and the air turned sharp with frost. Turok had just stoked his campfire, the flames crackling and dancing in the growing darkness. He sat against a large boulder, his rifle resting across his lap, watching the flickering light as it illuminated the surrounding wilderness. The sound of footsteps in the distance caught his attention. It was faint at first, barely audible over the crackling fire, but it was enough to stir something deep within him. He tensed, his sharp eyes scanning the shadows. It was a figure, moving cautiously, but with determination. At first, Turok thought it might be one of the local settlers, or perhaps another misguided traveler. But as the figure drew closer, he saw something that made his heart race. It was a woman, stumbling through the underbrush, her clothes torn and dirty, her face pale with fear. She had no idea what dangers lay ahead. She had no idea where she was. Her eyes were wild, darting around as if seeking safety in the vast expanse of the wilderness. But there was no safety here, at least, not for someone who was lost. Turok's instincts kicked in. He reached for his bow, drawing an arrow with a smooth motion, but he hesitated. Something about her, her desperation, her vulnerability, stopped him. He lowered his weapon and stood up, his boots crunching against the dry ground as he moved silently toward her. She was too close to his camp now. His traps had been triggered, the ones he had set long ago, meant to catch anyone foolish enough to wander too close. And she was exactly that. Foolish. But there was something else about her, a look of defeat, of exhaustion. She wasn't just lost. She was running from something or someone. Turok's gaze hardened as he stepped closer, closing the distance between them. The woman had fallen to the ground, her legs too weak to carry her any further. She collapsed beside his campfire, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Turok crouched down, his eyes scanning her for signs of injury. She had cuts on her arms, bruises on her face, and her clothes were in tatters. Her desperation was evident, but so was the terror in her eyes. She was a stranger, yet something about her tugged at his conscience. He had lived alone for so long, surviving by his own rules, trusting no one. But as he looked down at her, a part of him knew that things would never be the same again. In that moment, her fate and his were intertwined. She was no longer just another lost traveler. She was a person in need. And Turok, for the first time in years, was faced with the choice of whether to offer help or to turn away. But could he really turn his back on her, knowing what had brought her here? Could he truly remain the solitary figure he had been for so long? The questions lingered in his mind as he knelt beside her, his voice low but steady. "You're safe now. I won't let them find you." Turok carefully lifted the woman from the ground, his strong arms cradling her as though she weighed nothing. She was lighter than he had expected, the harshness of the wilderness already showing in her frail form. His eyes scanned the darkening sky, the sun sinking behind the hills, leaving the air crisp with the chill of night. She had fainted by the time he carried her into the small shelter he had built for himself. It was nothing more than a simple lean-to made of branches, hidden among the rocks, but it had served him well. He gently laid her down on the bedroll, her face still pale, her chest rising and falling with labored breaths. Tarak knelt beside her, his sharp eyes scanning the cuts and bruises that marked her skin. They were fresh, the blood still drying on her arms and legs. Whoever had done this to her was ruthless. He couldn't understand it. Why had they done this to her? He had seen violence in many forms, but this was something different. A feeling of protectiveness began to grow within him. The old instinct, the one he had buried deep down, was surfacing once more. He had never wanted to be part of the world again, but now, with this woman lying in front of him, something shifted. He moved swiftly, preparing a small fire in the corner of his camp. As the flames flickered to life, he reached for the small pouch of herbs he kept in his pack. He had learned to treat injuries from years of surviving in the wilderness. His hands worked efficiently, his mind focused entirely on the woman in front of him. He could feel the weight of her presence in the quiet of the night, and it unsettled him. For so long, he had lived in isolation, choosing his solitude over the chaos of the world. But now, as he carefully wrapped a bandage around her wrist, he realized that his life would never be the same. He couldn't just leave her. Tarak had no idea who she was or where she had come from, but he knew that he would not let harm come to her. He had made that decision the moment he saw her stumble into his camp. The woman shifted slightly, her eyelids fluttering. For a moment, he thought she might wake, but then she slipped back into unconsciousness. He sat beside her, his back against the wall of his shelter, his rifle close by. He stared into the flames, lost in thought. He had known loneliness for so long, but now, as he sat there watching over her, he felt something he hadn't in years. It was a strange feeling, one he wasn't used to. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't alone. Tarak spent the night in the shelter, his eyes never straying far from her. The wind howled outside, but inside the small camp, there was only the sound of their breathing. His mind kept drifting to the events that had led her here. He needed answers. Who was she running from? And why? The next morning, the woman stirred, her eyes opening slowly. She looked confused at first, her gaze flickering around the small shelter before landing on Tarak. She tensed for a moment, but then her eyes softened when she saw the kindness in his expression. He spoke softly, his voice steady but unfamiliar to both of them. "You're safe now," he said, his eyes never leaving hers. "You don't need to worry. I won't let anyone harm you." She looked at him for a moment, her eyes searching his face. He knew she had questions, but he also knew she wasn't ready to ask them yet. She was still too vulnerable, still too broken from whatever she had been through. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words didn't come. Instead, she closed her eyes and let out a deep breath, as if the weight of her journey had finally caught up with her. Tarak waited, giving her the space she needed. He didn't know what had driven her to this point, but he could feel the heaviness of her past weighing on her. She had no idea who he was, no idea why he had saved her, but he would protect her for as long as she needed. And, for the first time in years, he wasn't sure where that would lead. They sat in silence for a while, the only sound the crackling of the fire. Tarak's mind raced, his thoughts spinning in 1,000 directions. He had lived alone for so long, and now, suddenly, there was another person in his life, someone who depended on him. But he couldn't help but wonder if he was ready for this, if he was ready for the responsibility of another person's life. But in that moment, as he looked down at the woman resting on the bedroll, he knew that there was no turning back. He had made his choice, and the path ahead, whatever it was, would be one they would walk together. Tarak sat still, watching the woman as she rested. Her breath was steady now, but he could see the marks of exhaustion in her face. It was clear she had been through far too much. The violence that had followed her was still fresh in her mind, though she had yet to speak of it. Tarak couldn't help but wonder what kind of man could treat her this way. What kind of cruelty could leave a woman so broken? He shook the thoughts from his mind. There was little use in dwelling on things he couldn't control. His focus now was her, keeping her safe, protecting her from whatever it was that had driven her to this point. The sun had risen higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the camp. The fire had burned down to embers, leaving only a faint warmth in the air. Tarak stood and stretched, his body still sore from the tension of the previous night. He stepped outside the shelter, glancing around to ensure the area was secure. The land here was wild and dangerous, but it was also familiar to him. He had learned how to survive in these mountains, how to read the signs of danger. But this wasn't about his survival anymore. This was about hers. As he stood in the quiet, he could hear the faint rustle of leaves in the wind, the distant call of an eagle. It was a peaceful morning, a rare moment of calm. But inside him, there was a storm brewing. He didn't know who had done this to her, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let them hurt her again. When he returned to the shelter, the woman was sitting up now, her gaze fixed on the fire. She didn't look at him, but he could tell she was aware of his presence. Tarak didn't speak at first. He gave her time to adjust to the reality of her situation, time to process the kindness he had shown her. He wasn't sure what she expected from him. He wasn't a hero, just a man who had been living alone for too long. But the way she looked at him, it was clear that something had changed between them. She was no longer just another stranger. She was someone in need, someone who had been saved, and perhaps someone who would save him in return. He didn't know how that would happen, or even if it would, but something inside him felt different. He wasn't alone anymore. The woman finally spoke, her voice soft but clear. "Who are you?" she asked. The question was simple enough, but it caught him off guard. For a moment, he didn't know how to answer. He wasn't used to speaking about himself, especially to someone who had just stumbled into his life. "I'm no one special," he replied, his voice steady. "Just a man trying to live in peace." The woman looked at him then, her eyes filled with something he couldn't quite place. It was gratitude, perhaps, or maybe it was curiosity. But there was something else there too, something deeper, something that told him she wasn't as broken as she seemed. "Why did you help me?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. He paused for a moment before answering, his gaze fixed on the fire. "I couldn't let you die out there," he said quietly. "You're not the first person I've found in these mountains, but you're the first one I've decided to help." There was silence between them then, thick and heavy. The weight of his words hung in the air. She didn't ask why him, why here. She didn't need to. In that moment, they both understood. He had helped her because, despite everything, there was still a part of him that wasn't completely lost. The woman shifted, finally standing up from the bedroll. She looked around the small camp, her eyes scanning the surroundings. "Where am I?" she asked. "You're safe," Tarak replied, his tone gentle. "You're in my camp. It's the only place I can offer." She nodded, though she seemed lost in thought. "I don't know how to thank you," she said softly. "There's no need for thanks," Tarak replied. "But you'll need to rest. I'll gather some food." The woman hesitated before nodding again. As he stepped outside, Tarak could feel her eyes on him, but he didn't turn to meet them. There was something about her that unsettled him. He had lived alone for so long that the presence of another person, especially someone as vulnerable as she was a reminder of just how much he had shut out. He had never asked for company, never sought out friendship or affection. But now, with her here, things were different. For the first time in a long while, he found himself questioning the path he had chosen. Could he truly remain isolated, or had this woman, this lost bride, found a way into his heart? He didn't know. But as he moved through the wilderness, gathering what he needed for their meal, he couldn't shake the feeling that everything had changed. His life had been solitary for so long, but now it seemed as though it was about to take a turn he had never expected. The question was, would he be ready for it when the time came? Tarak returned to the camp with fresh game, a small deer he had managed to track down in the nearby woods. The woman was sitting by the fire when he arrived, her gaze distant, as if lost in thoughts she hadn't yet shared. He placed the deer on the ground, carefully arranging the meat to keep it from spoiling. His movements were methodical, efficient. He had done this countless times before, alone, but today there was something different. A sense of responsibility he hadn't felt in years. He couldn't help but notice the way her eyes followed his every move, a quiet curiosity in them. But there was more. Beneath that curiosity, he saw something else, recognition. She wasn't just observing him. She was watching, learning. He could feel her studying him, like she was trying to make sense of this man who had saved her life and brought her into his camp, someone she knew so little about. Tarak didn't mind. He had never been one for small talk, and the silence between them felt comfortable, even if it was thick with unspoken words. As he worked, he glanced over at her. She was still sitting by the fire, her back straight, her hands resting on her knees. The firelight flickered in her eyes, casting dancing shadows on her face, making her seem almost unreal. She had been through so much, and yet, She was still here, still breathing, still strong. It made him wonder what had brought her to this point. Who was she running from? What had driven her so far into the wilderness? Into his camp? The questions were like an itch in his mind, but he didn't ask. Not yet. Instead, he focused on the task at hand, skinning the deer with practiced ease. The air was still cold, the kind of cold that made the skin tingle with each breath, but inside the shelter, it was warm from the fire, and the smell of cooking meat began to fill the space around them. It was the kind of scent that could bring comfort, even in the most unfamiliar of places. When the meal was ready, Tarak set the meat in front of her. He didn't say anything, just gestured toward it, letting the simple act of sharing a meal speak for itself. She hesitated at first, her hands unsure as they reached for the food. But then, with a deep breath, she began to eat, taking slow, cautious bites. Tarak watched her, wondering if she could feel the weight of the moment, the unspoken bond that was beginning to form between them. The fire crackled between them, the only sound in the stillness of the night. After a while, the woman put her food down and looked up at him. Her expression had softened, and the tension that had clung to her seemed to dissipate a little. She spoke then, her voice low and steady. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, her eyes meeting his. There was no anger in her words, no accusation, just a quiet curiosity. Tarak paused for a moment, considering her question. He hadn't asked himself that. Why had he helped her? He had never been one to get involved with others, let alone risk his life for someone he didn't know. But here she was, sitting across from him, alive because of his actions. He had never cared about anyone enough to take that risk before. But something had shifted in him. Something about her, something about this moment, made him feel like maybe it was worth it. "I don't know," he replied, his voice steady but with a hint of uncertainty. "Maybe because I couldn't let you die out there. Maybe because you needed someone to help you." She didn't respond right away, her gaze drifting toward the fire, as if she were thinking deeply about his words. It was quiet again, but it was a comfortable silence now, one that didn't feel so heavy. Finally, she spoke again, this time more softly. "I don't know who I am anymore," she said, almost to herself. "I don't know where I belong." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, Tarak was struck by the vulnerability in her voice. It was as if she had been carrying the weight of her past for too long and was finally letting it slip out. He understood that. He had carried his own burdens for years, silently, never sharing them with anyone. But here, with her, it felt like maybe it was okay to let go of some of that weight. "You don't have to figure it all out right now," he said gently. "You're safe here. That's all that matters." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and in her eyes, he saw something he hadn't expected, trust. Not complete trust, not yet, but the beginning of it. It was a fragile thing, like a newly sprouted plant that needed careful tending. But it was there, and that was enough for him. For the first time in a long while, Tarak didn't feel so alone. There was something between them now, something that hadn't been there before. Maybe it was just a sense of shared survival, of two people thrown together by circumstance. Or maybe it was something more. He didn't know. But as the fire burned low, and the stars appeared overhead, he felt a sense of peace that he hadn't felt in years. She was still here, and for now, that was enough. Tarak woke early the next morning, the first light of day creeping through the dense trees surrounding his camp. He stood silently for a moment, taking in the crisp air, feeling the weight of the world shift slightly on his shoulders. The woman, who had been resting in his shelter, was still asleep, her breath soft and steady. He had made his decision the night before. This wasn't just about survival anymore. He couldn't walk away from her. She was part of his world now, whether he liked it or not. He had no idea how she had come to be in this situation, but he was sure of one thing. She wasn't leaving this camp alone. Not while he could do something about it. Tarak moved about the camp, quietly preparing breakfast. He worked efficiently, though his thoughts kept drifting. Back to her. He had never been a man who depended on anyone, and he had certainly never been a man to offer protection freely. But something had changed. She had changed that. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of her shifting in the shelter. He glanced over his shoulder to see her sitting up, her face still clouded with uncertainty, but something else was in her eyes now, a faint trace of trust. She hadn't asked much about him, but she had begun to observe his every move, as if she were weighing whether or not she could trust him. And why not? He had saved her, kept her safe, but that didn't erase the walls she had built around herself. Tarak could see that. He knew what it was like to shut people out, to build walls so high that nothing could get in. But it wasn't the same for her. She had lost everything. Whatever she had once known, whatever she had once been, it was gone now. And here she was, with him, a stranger in a strange land. He would have to be patient. The day went on, quiet and uneventful. Tarak kept to his routine, hunting and gathering what they needed, all the while keeping a watchful eye on her. She didn't speak much, but she followed his lead, learning how to move in the wilderness, how to make do with what was available. As the hours passed, he began to notice subtle changes in her. The way she held herself had shifted, the way she looked at him was different. She was no longer looking at him like a rescuer. There was something else now, an understanding. She was beginning to see him not as the man who had saved her life, but as someone who was sharing it with her. It was small, but it was enough for him to feel a shift within himself. As they sat by the fire that evening, a rare silence settled between them. It was comfortable, not heavy, and as Tarak stared into the flames, he could hear the woman's soft voice, breaking the quiet. "I used to think I was strong," she said, her voice a little shaky, but still determined. "I thought I could handle anything. But now," she trailed off, her eyes downcast. Tarak watched her for a moment, wondering what she meant by that. "Now you're here," he said simply. "And that's enough." The woman looked at him, her eyes searching his face, as if looking for some kind of answer that she had been unable to find elsewhere. "You don't have to be strong all the time," he continued, his voice steady, offering her something he had never offered anyone else: understanding. Sometimes surviving is enough. There was a long pause as she processed his words, and for the first time since he had found her, he saw a flicker of something in her eyes, a glimmer of hope, however faint. It wasn't much, but it was something, and for Tarak, that was enough. The fire crackled between them, the only sound in the night. The wind rustled the leaves above, but it felt like the world had fallen away, leaving just the two of them in the quiet of the wilderness. He had no idea what tomorrow would bring. He didn't know what the future held for either of them. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like maybe, just maybe, there was a future. Together, they might find something worth living for. He couldn't promise her answers, but he could offer her his protection, his company, and the knowledge that, no matter what happened, he would not leave her behind. "You're not alone anymore," he said quietly, his words barely above a whisper. She didn't respond immediately, but he saw the small shift in her shoulders, the release of tension that had been there since the moment he found her. It was the smallest of movements, but it was enough. Tarak had given her something that no one else had. The choice was now hers, whether she wanted to accept it or not. And he would wait. For as long as it took, he would wait. The night stretched on, and as the fire burned low, Tarak knew that, whatever came next, they would face it together. Tarak woke to the sound of birds calling in the early morning light. The forest around him was still, save for the whispering breeze that rustled the leaves high in the trees. His camp was quieter than usual, and the familiar weight of the solitude that had once comforted him now seemed to pull at his chest. He glanced over at the woman, who was still asleep, her face peaceful for the first time since he had found her. She had not spoken much in the last few days, only offering small glances or brief exchanges when necessary. Yet, the air between them had shifted in the most subtle of ways, as though they were beginning to find an unspoken understanding. Tarak stood up quietly, careful not to disturb her, and stretched his legs. The fresh air was sharp with the scent of pine, and the ground beneath his feet was soft with the dampness of the night's dew. He set to work immediately, gathering wood for the fire and checking the traps he had set the previous day. The routine was familiar to him, his body moving almost automatically, but this morning, there was a difference. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. The woman, still nameless in his mind, was no longer just a stranger he had rescued. She was part of his world now, and that realization came with an unfamiliar weight. As the sun slowly rose higher in the sky, spilling golden light over the landscape, he noticed her stirring in the shelter. He hesitated, unsure of how to approach the next step in their fragile alliance. They had settled into a rhythm, yes, but neither of them had yet truly spoken about what had happened or what would come next. When she emerged from the shelter, her hair tousled from sleep, she looked at him with quiet eyes, as if assessing him in the same way he had been watching her. For a long moment, they simply stood there, saying nothing. Then, in a voice that seemed almost foreign to her, she spoke. "I've been thinking," she said softly, "about what you said, about not being alone anymore." Tarak turned to face her fully, his hands still busy with the firewood. "And?" he asked, trying to keep his voice neutral, though a knot formed in his stomach at the sound of her words. She took a step closer, her gaze lowering to the ground before meeting his again. "I don't know what I expected from you when I first came here," she said. "Maybe I thought you were just some kind of wandering hermit, someone who would help because it was the right thing to do. But now I see you're not just that. You're someone who has chosen this life, chosen to stay here, alone, in this wild place. And she paused, her hands nervously fidgeting. "I don't know if I can fit into that, into your world." Tarak remained silent for a long time, watching her carefully, trying to make sense of what she had just said. He had always known that his solitary existence wouldn't be something that others would understand. His isolation was by choice, a decision to remove himself from the conflicts and pain that had once defined his life. But now, with her here, those walls he had so carefully built were beginning to crack. He had never expected to share his life with someone, and now, it seemed that he would have to face the reality of whether he could let someone in. "You don't have to be like me," Tarak said quietly. "I didn't bring you here to change your life. I brought you here to keep you safe. You can leave whenever you want. But if you stay, it's because you choose to. It's not because you feel you have to fit into something you don't want." The woman looked at him for a long time, her eyes searching his face for something, for answers, maybe. Finally, she nodded slowly. "I don't know what I want yet," she admitted. "But I know that for now, I'm not ready to leave. I need time." Tarak could feel the weight of her words, the fragility in them. She wasn't ready to fully trust him, but she wasn't ready to leave either. It was a start, a small one, but it was a start. And for now, that was enough. For the next few days, the silence between them deepened, but it was no longer an uncomfortable silence. They moved together through the wilderness as a pair, working side by side, sharing the chores and tasks without speaking much. They both knew what needed to be done, and for now, that was all that mattered. The woman grew stronger with each passing day. Her movements became more sure, her steps more steady. She learned to move with the rhythm of the forest, to find the trails and streams that Tarak had memorized long ago. Slowly, the mistrust that had once clouded her eyes began to fade, replaced by something else. A quiet respect. Tarak had never been one for grand gestures. He didn't have to be. Every day, through their actions, they spoke louder than words ever could. But still, something hung between them, something unspoken, a question neither of them had answered. What would happen next? The world around them continued to change, the seasons slowly shifting, and with them, so did the path ahead. Tarak knew that, sooner or later, they would have to confront the reality of what was happening between them. But for now, he was content to let it unfold on its own. For the first time in a long time, he felt the faintest stirrings of hope. He wasn't alone anymore. And maybe, just maybe, he never would be again. Tarak woke before dawn, the cold air of the mountain desert biting at his skin. The silence of the wilderness was profound, broken only by the distant call of an eagle and the soft rustling of the wind through the trees. His camp was quiet, peaceful, and yet, the weight of the coming days pressed heavily on him. He had been living alone for so long, and now, with the woman there, everything felt different. He had never truly considered what it would mean to share this place, this life, with someone else. But here she was, a stranger who had become a part of his world in ways he hadn't expected. Tarak moved quietly around the camp, gathering firewood and checking the perimeter. His movements were fluid, practiced. He had lived in these mountains for years, and he knew every trail, every sound, every shift in the air. But there was one thing he hadn't prepared for: the woman. Her presence had changed everything. He glanced toward the shelter where she had slept the night before. She was still inside, though he could hear the soft sound of her breathing. She had been different lately, more settled, her movements more confident as she learned the ways of the wilderness. The first few days after she had arrived, she had been withdrawn, cautious, barely speaking more than necessary. But now, something had shifted between them. She was no longer a stranger to him. He didn't know exactly when it happened, But she had stopped being just the woman he had saved from the wilderness. She had become someone important, someone he couldn't ignore. And that was a problem, because the more he allowed himself to care for her, the more vulnerable he became. He could feel it, the pull toward her, the strange sense of connection that was growing between them. It made him uneasy. He had spent so long guarding his heart, building walls to keep everyone out. And now, here she was, unknowingly tearing them down. He couldn't let that happen. He had to keep his distance. He wasn't the kind of man who allowed anyone to get too close. He had learned that the hard way. When she emerged from the shelter, her face was still soft with sleep, her hair wild and tangled from the night. She caught his eye, offering him a quiet smile that made something stir inside him. She was becoming more comfortable here, in this camp, with him. It was a relief, but it also made him nervous. "Good morning," she said, her voice still a little hoarse from sleep. Tarak nodded in return, his gaze shifting to the fire he had just built. "I'm going to check the traps. You can stay here or come with me." She hesitated for a moment, clearly unsure. "I'll come with you," she said finally, standing up and brushing the dirt from her pants. Tarak led the way through the thick underbrush, his eyes scanning the ground for signs of animals. The woman followed him closely, staying just a few paces behind. She had become a decent tracker in the past few days, learning quickly how to identify fresh footprints and signs of wildlife. As they moved deeper into the forest, Tarak felt the tension between them. It wasn't physical, not exactly. It was something unspoken, a distance that neither of them had addressed. He could feel her eyes on him, studying him, and he knew that she was beginning to see through his walls, to see the man he really was. The problem was, he didn't want her to see that man. He didn't want her to know the things he had done, the choices he had made. But as they moved through the forest, with the soft crunch of leaves beneath their feet and the scent of pine in the air, he couldn't help but feel that maybe, just maybe, he was starting to care for her. When they reached the trap line, Tarak stopped, crouching to check the snares he had set. The woman crouched down beside him, her fingers brushing lightly against his. It was brief, just a touch, but it was enough to send a wave of heat through him. He pulled his hand back, looking away, his mind racing. He couldn't let this happen. He had to keep control. He couldn't afford to be vulnerable, not again. "This one's still set," Tarak muttered, his voice rough. He stood up and moved to the next trap. The woman followed, silently. The next few hours were spent checking the traps, with Tarak saying little and the woman following along, her quiet presence both comforting and unnerving. It wasn't long before they made their way back to camp, the silence between them now thicker than before. They had enough food for the day, and that was all that mattered. But as they walked back, Tarak couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed between them. Something had shifted. He didn't know what it was, but he could feel it in the way she looked at him, in the way she moved beside him. They were no longer just two people who had crossed paths in the wilderness. They were something more. But what that something was, he wasn't sure. Back at camp, they ate in silence, the fire crackling between them. Tarak's mind was a whirlwind, but he didn't speak. He couldn't. He couldn't tell her the truth, not yet. He had to keep his distance, for both of their sakes. But as the evening wore on and the stars began to emerge in the sky, Tarak realized something. He couldn't keep running from the truth. He couldn't hide from what was happening between them. And for the first time in a long while, he wasn't sure he wanted to. Tarak had always been a man of few words, preferring the quiet of the wilderness to the noise of civilization. He had spent so long in isolation that the idea of companionship, of shared space, felt foreign to him. Yet, in the days since the woman had entered his life, he had found himself looking at the world through a different lens. She had become more than just a survivor, more than someone he had saved from the wilderness. She was now someone who shared this life with him. And as they sat by the fire, the heat of the flames flickering in the darkness, Tarak felt the weight of the decision he had been avoiding for so long. They had both been running from something. She, from a past filled with loss and pain. Him, from a past that had forced him to close his heart to the world. But now, sitting across from her, something had changed. The silence between them had deepened, but it was no longer filled with tension. It was a comfortable silence, one that spoke of understanding. The woman, still not fully healed, had begun to find solace in the routine of their days. She had learned to hunt alongside him, to track and gather, and in doing so, had regained a sense of purpose that she had lost in the chaos of her past. And though she still had her moments of quiet reflection, there was a lightness to her now, a small spark of hope that had not been there before. Tarak watched her in the firelight, her face illuminated by the flickering glow. Her eyes, once filled with suspicion and fear, were now soft with acceptance. He had never imagined that this would be his life, this quiet, tentative companionship. The woman spoke softly, breaking the silence between them. "Tarak," she began, her voice hesitant. "I've been thinking." He glanced up, meeting her gaze for the first time in a long while. "About what?" he asked, though part of him already knew. She took a deep breath, as if gathering the courage to say what had been on her mind for days. "About what you said the other day, about not being alone anymore." Tarak didn't respond immediately. He had said those words without thinking, offering a comfort he wasn't sure he had the right to give. But now, as she spoke, he realized just how much they had meant to her. "I don't know if I can ever truly stop running from what happened," she continued, her eyes dropping to the ground as if the weight of her past was too much to bear. "But I'm starting to think that maybe I don't have to run anymore. Not from you, not from this." Her words hit him harder than he expected. He had never thought of her as someone who was running from him, from the safety he offered. But in that moment, he realized how much she had been carrying with her. "You don't have to run," Tarak said, his voice low but steady. "Not from me. Not from anything." The fire crackled between them, casting long shadows across the camp. The night air was still, and for a moment, it felt as though time had stopped. She looked at him, her eyes searching his face for some hint of doubt, but finding none. She nodded slowly, as if accepting the weight of his words. "I've been afraid," she said quietly. "Afraid that I would never be able to trust anyone again. Afraid that I'd always be on my own, no matter where I went." Tarak felt a pang of empathy. He had known that fear all too well. The fear of being alone in a world that seemed to offer no refuge. "You're not alone," he said softly, the words coming more naturally than he had expected. "Not anymore." It wasn't a promise of forever. He couldn't give her that. But it was a promise for today, for this moment. And in that moment, it was enough. The night stretched on, the stars above them flickering like distant lanterns in the sky. As the fire burned low, Tarak found himself thinking about what tomorrow would bring. He had never planned for a future that included someone else, but now that she was here, he realized he couldn't imagine facing it alone. She had become a part of his world in a way he hadn't expected, and maybe that was the greatest gift he could offer. The woman shifted slightly, breaking the stillness once more. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice quiet, but laced with the same uncertainty that had once defined their lives. Tarak paused, looking up at the sky before returning his gaze to her. "We keep going," he said simply. "One day at a time." There were no grand plans, no promises for the future, just the simple act of moving forward. Together. It was all they could do. And for the first time in a long time, Tarak felt the smallest flicker of hope stir in his chest. He wasn't alone anymore. And neither was she. Tarak had spent most of his life learning how to survive on his own. He knew the land, the rhythm of the seasons, and how to hunt and gather with a precision that could only come from years of solitude. But as the days passed, he began to realize that survival wasn't enough anymore. He wasn't just living anymore. He was starting to hope. The woman had changed that. As they settled into a routine, something deeper began to form between them. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something close, something that had the potential to grow into something more. But there was still a wall between them, one that neither of them was ready to tear down completely. That wall was the past, and neither of them was willing to face it. Tarak's past was dark, filled with loss and regret. He had abandoned everything, his family, his people, choosing isolation over the chaos of the world. It had been easier that way. He had made peace with it, or so he thought. The woman, too, carried the weight of her past. She had been running from something, someone, for as long as she could remember. But now, here, in this camp, with Tarak, she was beginning to find peace, or at least a semblance of it. Still, they both knew that their time together couldn't last forever. Eventually, the outside world would catch up with them, and when it did, everything would change. One evening, as the fire burned low, Tarak sat across from her, watching the flames flicker and dance. The silence between them had become more comfortable, but there was still an unspoken tension. The woman had been quieter than usual that day, her eyes distant, as though lost in thought. Tarak didn't press her for answers. He had learned over the years that people needed their space. But tonight, something felt different. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen, that the balance they had found was about to be disrupted. "Tarak," she said, her voice soft but clear, breaking the silence between them. He looked up, meeting her gaze for the first time that evening. "I need to talk to you," she continued, her hands fidgeting nervously in her lap. He nodded, setting his knife down and giving her his full attention. "I know we've been getting used to each other, and I know things are different now," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "But I don't know how long I can stay here, with you. I don't know if I can keep running from everything. From my past, from what's waiting for me out there." Tarak's heart tightened. He had expected this, but hearing her say it out loud made it real. She was struggling, torn between the life she had found with him and the life she had been trying to escape. "I'm not asking you to stay forever," Tarak said, his voice low, steady. "But if you need to go, I won't stop you." The woman looked at him then, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and sadness. "I don't know what to do," she whispered. "I don't know what's worse, facing what's waiting for me out there, or staying here with you and never knowing if I'm truly safe." Tarak stood up and walked over to where she sat, his boots crunching softly on the ground. He crouched down in front of her, his face inches from hers. "You're safe here," he said, his voice intense. "As long as you're with me, you'll be safe. But you don't have to stay if you don't want to." She reached out then, her hand trembling as she placed it on his arm. The touch was gentle, but it sent a shock of warmth through him. "I don't want to leave," she said quietly. "But I'm afraid of what's out there. I'm afraid that if I stay, I'll never be free of it. I'll never be free of my past." Tarak looked down at her hand on his arm, feeling the weight of her words. He knew what it was like to run from the past, to try to bury it in the hope that it would never catch up with you. But he also knew that no matter how far you ran, the past always found a way to catch up. "You can't outrun your past," he said softly. "But you can choose what you do with it. You can choose to face it, or you can keep running. But you don't have to do it alone." The woman looked up at him then, her eyes searching his face, as though trying to find the truth in his words. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled softly between them, casting flickering shadows on their faces. Finally, the woman broke the silence. "I don't know what I'm doing," she admitted. "But I don't want to keep running. I want to face it. I want to stop being afraid." Tarak's heart swelled with a mixture of pride and relief. She was ready to face whatever lay ahead, ready to stop running. And for the first time in a long time, Tarak realized that he wasn't afraid of the future anymore, not as long as they were facing it together. He stood up and offered her his hand. "Then let's face it together," he said quietly. She took his hand, her fingers trembling slightly, but she didn't let go. And for the first time since they had met, they both knew that the path ahead would be uncertain, but as long as they had each other, they would walk it together. Tarak and the woman, now standing side by side, didn't say much as they prepared to leave the safety of their camp. The weight of their decision hung heavily between them, neither of them fully sure of what lay ahead, but both knowing that they couldn't stay in hiding forever. They had faced their fears together, shared moments of vulnerability, and built something between them, something real. But now, it was time to face the outside world, the one they had both been running from in different ways. The wilderness had been kind to them, but they knew it couldn't shelter them forever. As Tarak gathered his things, the woman quietly packed her own small bundle. The sound of the fire crackling behind them seemed to echo in the silence, a final reminder of the peace they had found. Neither of them spoke of what was to come, but both were aware that the outside world held dangers they couldn't ignore. They moved slowly, as if the weight of the journey was too much to bear all at once. Tarak glanced at the woman, who had grown stronger in the time they had shared. She was no longer the broken figure who had stumbled into his camp weeks ago. Her movements were more assured, her eyes no longer clouded with fear, but filled with the resolve of someone who had come to terms with their past. He could see that she was ready, even if he wasn't entirely sure he was. They made their way through the thick forest, the trees towering above them, their shadows stretching long in the early morning light. Every step felt heavier than the last, as though the forest itself was reluctant to let them go. Tarak kept his hand on the hilt of his knife, his senses heightened. He had never been one to trust the world outside his camp, but he had learned that in moments like these, trust was something that had to be earned. He had no illusions about the dangers that awaited them. There were people out there, and they would stop at nothing to find them, to drag them back to a past neither of them wanted to face. They walked in silence for a long time, the path before them twisting and turning, as if the land itself was trying to challenge them. They stopped only when the sun reached its highest point in the sky, the heat of the day making the air thick with tension. Tarak sat down on a large rock, his eyes scanning the surroundings. The woman, still silent, joined him, sitting a few feet away. It was strange, he thought, how much they had come to rely on each other. In such a short time, they had built something that neither of them could have predicted. He wasn't used to sharing his life with anyone, and yet, here they were, bound together by forces neither of them had asked for. She spoke first, her voice steady but quiet. "I'm not afraid of what comes next," she said. Tarak turned to look at her, surprised by the conviction in her voice. "You're not?" he asked. She shook her head slowly. "No, I'm not afraid of facing the past anymore. I'm not afraid of what it will take to move forward. But I am afraid of losing what we have." Tarak's heart tightened at her words. He had felt it too, the fragile thread that connected them, the bond that had been built not on promises, but on shared experiences, survival, and trust. "We won't lose it," he said, his voice softer than he had intended. "I won't let anything take it from us." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and for the first time since they had met, Tarak felt a sense of certainty. They had both made choices, decisions that had brought them to this point. And now, as they stood on the edge of something new, they would face whatever came next together. They were not alone anymore. It was a simple truth, but one that meant everything. The silence between them was no longer heavy with uncertainty. It was the kind of silence that comes when two people are finally in sync with each other. Tarak stood, offering her his hand. She took it without hesitation, her grip strong and sure. They continued their journey, side by side, through the dense forest, their footsteps steady and synchronized. The further they walked, the more Tarak realized that the world wasn't as cold and unforgiving as he had once believed. With the woman by his side, he could face anything. And maybe, just maybe, they could build a future, not in the shadows of their pasts, but in the light of a new beginning. Tarak and the woman walked in silence, the weight of their unspoken agreement pressing down on them as the forest stretched endlessly before them. They had moved farther from the camp, deeper into the wilderness, and yet, despite the stillness around them, the air between them hummed with something else, something that felt like the calm before a storm. It had been several days since they had made the decision to face whatever came next together, and now, as they moved through the forest, Tarak could feel the inevitability of their journey beginning to take shape. He had long known the wilds of the land, but what lay ahead for them, in the larger world outside, was a question neither of them had the answers to. Tarak's mind wandered to their conversation from the night before. The woman had finally stopped running, finally stopped hiding. She had accepted the truth of what they were facing, their shared past, their shared future, and while neither of them had voiced it aloud, there was an unspoken understanding between them now. They were no longer just two survivors of a harsh world. They were companions, bound together by the circumstances of their lives. They had fought their own battles, survived their own tragedies, and now they would face whatever came next as a team. Tarak knew that there would be challenges ahead. The world they were entering was not kind, and the past they had left behind was sure to catch up with them. There were still dangers in the world, and people who would want to tear them apart. But for the first time in a long while, he felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years: hope. It wasn't much, and he didn't know what form it would take, but it was there, and that was enough for him. The woman, walking beside him, seemed to sense his thoughts. She had been quiet for a while, and now, as they moved through the thick underbrush, she spoke. "Tarak," she said, her voice low, yet there was a firmness to it that told him she had made up her mind. "I think I'm ready." He glanced at her, surprised by the suddenness of her words. "Ready?" he asked, his voice betraying a hint of confusion. "Ready for what?" She looked ahead, her eyes scanning the trail, but there was a softness to her expression. "Ready to face what comes. Ready to stop running, not just from my past, but from what could be our future." ready to be here, with you, for whatever that means. Tarak felt a lump form in his throat as her words settled over him. He had never expected her to say something like that. In the weeks they had spent together, he had sensed that she was still unsure, still hesitant to fully trust him, to fully embrace the future they could have. But now, as she stood there beside him, there was a sense of certainty in her voice. She was ready to move forward, and that meant everything. He nodded, his chest tight with emotion he couldn't name. Then we'll face it together, he said, his voice low but steady. Whatever it is, we'll face it together. The words seemed to settle between them, like a promise, one that neither of them had made lightly. But it was a promise that Tarak could keep, and he knew she could, too. They moved onward, the forest stretching before them as they continued down the path. The world was vast, and they were small in comparison, but for the first time in a long while, Tarak felt like they had a purpose. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was living, with her. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest floor, the air grew cooler. They set up camp by a small stream, the sound of the water trickling over rocks providing a calming backdrop to their quiet evening. Tarak started a fire, the flames casting a warm glow over their small camp. The woman, her movements now more confident, helped prepare their meal, her hands moving with practiced ease. It was the first time in a long while that Tarak felt like they were a team, working in tandem, not just surviving but building something together. As they ate, the silence between them was comfortable, the kind that comes when two people have learned to trust each other without the need for words. After the meal, they sat side by the fire, watching as the flames flickered and danced in the growing darkness. Tarak felt the weight of the day lift off his shoulders. They had made it this far, and together, they would keep going. The future was still uncertain, and the world outside their camp was unpredictable, but in that moment, with the woman by his side, Tarak knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. Tomorrow we move on, he said, his voice breaking the silence. But for tonight, we're safe. The woman nodded, her eyes soft with a quiet understanding. For tonight, we're safe, she echoed, her words a simple truth. And in that moment, as the fire crackled between them, Tarak realized that no matter what the future held, they had already found something worth fighting for. Tarak awoke the next morning with the faint light of dawn breaking through the dense canopy above. The forest was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze and the distant call of birds. The fire from the night before had died down to embers, and the woman was still asleep beside him, her breathing steady and calm. Tarak had been living alone for so long, but now, with her by his side, the world felt different. For the first time in years, he wasn't just surviving. He was sharing his life with someone, and it was a feeling he had not expected to experience again. They had made it through the night, a small victory in a world that seemed determined to break them both. But as he glanced at her, he knew that their journey was far from over. There was still so much uncertainty, so much that they couldn't control, but they had made a choice, together. They had chosen to face whatever came next. As the morning sun slowly began to rise, Tarak stood up and stretched his stiff muscles. His body ached from the constant physical exertion of the past few days, but there was something else now, something inside him that felt lighter. For the first time, he didn't feel alone. The woman had become a part of his world in ways he hadn't anticipated. She had proven herself capable, resilient, and strong, qualities that had drawn him to her in ways he couldn't explain. As the woman stirred and slowly opened her eyes, Tarak gave her a moment to adjust before speaking. "We should head out soon," he said, his voice low but steady. She sat up, looking at him with those tired but determined eyes. She nodded. "I'm ready," she said softly. Her words carried a weight of understanding, a sense of resolve that he had come to admire. She wasn't just going along with him anymore. She was choosing to face whatever came next, right alongside him. They packed up their small camp quickly, moving with the efficiency of two people who had learned to rely on each other. The fire was completely out now, and the morning air felt crisp against their skin as they made their way back into the wilderness. They followed the path that Tarak had grown so familiar with, the one that led further away from the comfort of their camp and deeper into the unknown. The trail was rugged and challenging, the kind of terrain that had always kept the world at arm's length. But now, With the woman at his side, it felt different. They weren't just two people wandering aimlessly anymore. They were moving forward with a purpose. Tarak had learned to be self-sufficient, to trust only in himself. But the woman had made him rethink everything. She had taught him that survival was not just about fighting to stay alive. It was about fighting to live, about allowing yourself to trust someone else, to share your life with them. He could feel the change in himself, subtle but undeniable. It wasn't just about keeping her safe anymore. It was about building something together, something that could last. They stopped by a stream to rest, the sound of the water soothing their tired bodies. Tarak crouched down to drink from the clear, cold water, and the woman followed suit. The silence between them was no longer uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that comes when two people are in sync, when their thoughts and actions align without the need for words. As they rested, Tarak looked at her, studying her face in the soft light of the morning. She was stronger now, more at ease in the wilderness, and it made him feel proud of her. She had come a long way since the day he had found her, broken and scared, in the forest. Now, she was standing tall, ready to face whatever lay ahead. He could see the fire in her eyes, a fire that matched his own, and it made him realize that they had become something more than just survivors. They were a team, and together, they could face anything. "What happens when we find the people you're running from?" she asked, breaking the silence between them. Tarak had expected the question, but hearing it from her still made his chest tighten. He had tried not to think about it, tried to push it to the back of his mind. The truth was, he didn't know what would happen. He didn't know how they would deal with whatever was waiting for them. But he knew one thing for sure. He would not let anything happen to her. "We'll handle it," he said, his voice steady, though uncertainty lingered in his mind. Together. She looked at him for a moment, studying him, and for the first time, she seemed to fully trust his words. There was no hesitation in her gaze, no more fear or doubt. She believed him, and that belief, that trust, was enough to strengthen Tarak's resolve. The path ahead was still uncertain, and they both knew that the world they had chosen to face would not be kind to them. But as they stood by the stream, side by side, Tarak knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. And that was more than he had ever allowed himself to believe. As they packed up once again and continued on the path, their steps were sure and steady. They were no longer just two people walking through the wilderness. They were a unit, a force that could survive, not just because they had to, but because they had chosen to. The future was still unknown, but with each step they took, they were writing their own story, a story of survival, trust, and the unspoken bond that had formed between them. And for the first time in a long time, Tarak felt ready to face whatever came next. Tarak and the woman continued their journey, their steps in sync as they walked deeper into the unknown. The forest around them had become a part of their world now, a silent witness to the changes that had taken place within both of them. They no longer walked as two strangers in the wilderness. They had become something else, partners, comrades, and perhaps, in the quiet moments, even something more. The weight of their shared experience bound them together, and the bond between them had grown stronger with each passing day. The woman no longer looked over her shoulder in fear, no longer flinched at every sound in the trees. She had found her place in this new life, and Tarak had found his own way of sharing it with her. As the days passed, they grew more accustomed to the rhythm of their new life. The silence between them, once heavy with unspoken words, was now filled with understanding. They communicated in glances, small gestures, and shared tasks. The fire they built at night was no longer just for warmth. It had become a symbol of the life they were building together. There were still moments of doubt, moments when the shadows of their pasts crept into their minds. But in those moments, they found strength in each other. They had each made peace with the fact that the world was full of uncertainty. But they had each other, and for the first time, that was enough. One evening, as they sat by the fire, the woman broke the quiet that had settled between them. "Tarak," she said, her voice softer than usual. "I've been thinking." He glanced up at her, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife. He had learned to expect these quiet moments of reflection from her. It was how she processed things, slowly, carefully, like she was finding her way through a maze. "What about?" he asked, though he already knew it was something important. "About everything," she said, her eyes reflecting the light of the fire. "About how far we've come. How different things are now. Tarak didn't answer right away. He didn't need to. They both knew how much had changed. They had come a long way from the people they once were. In this wilderness, they had found something new, something worth fighting for. It's strange, she continued, her voice a little distant. How much can change in such a short time? I came here thinking I was running away from everything. And now I realize I found something I didn't even know I needed. Tarak met her gaze, his eyes steady. You found yourself, he said simply. And you found me. She smiled, a small, genuine smile that tugged at his heart in a way he hadn't expected. And you found me, she echoed. There was a long pause, a silence that was comfortable, filled with understanding. Tarak knew that the woman had come to trust him in ways she hadn't trusted anyone before. And he had come to rely on her in ways he hadn't allowed himself to do in years. It was the kind of partnership he had never imagined he would have. It was the kind of bond that didn't need words to be understood. The world outside their camp remained unknown, but together, they had found a sense of peace. They had learned to navigate the wilderness, both the physical landscape and the emotional one. They had learned that survival wasn't just about the strength to endure. It was about the strength to trust, to share, and to open up to the possibility of a future together. Tarak had spent so long alone, fighting battles on his own, that he had forgotten what it felt like to have someone by his side. But now, with her there, the idea of being alone seemed distant, almost foreign. Do you think we'll ever find the people you're running from? She asked, her voice steady but filled with a tinge of uncertainty. Tarak sighed, his gaze drifting toward the horizon where the sky met the treetops. I don't know, he said honestly. But I do know one thing. We'll face it, whatever it is, together. We've faced too much already to let fear stand in our way now. She nodded, her expression softening. Together, she repeated, and the word felt like a promise. They sat in silence for a while, watching the fire burn low. The crackling of the flames was the only sound that filled the night, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind of silence that came with shared trust and understanding, the kind of silence that comes when two people have learned to live with each other's presence. Eventually, Tarak stood, stretching his arms above his head. The night was quiet, and the stars shone brightly above them. It felt like the right moment to move on, to leave the camp behind and continue their journey. We should get some rest, he said, though the idea of sleep felt less important than it had in the past. He was more aware of the woman beside him now than ever before. Tomorrow, we keep moving. She stood up with him, her movements fluid and sure. Tomorrow, we keep moving, she repeated. And as they walked toward their small shelter, side by side, Tarak knew that whatever came next, they were ready. Together, they would face whatever the future held. And that was all they needed. This gripping story unfolds in the untamed wilderness, following two lost souls who come together to face their fears and the harsh realities of survival. As they journey through the rugged terrain, they discover strength in each other and begin to realize that the path to survival isn't just about enduring the wild, but also learning to trust and live with others. The storyline delves deep into their emotional growth, illustrating their shared struggle to confront their pasts while building a future together. Through moments of quiet reflection and intense action, this narrative embodies the essence of classic Western stories. As the characters face external threats and internal doubts, their bond strengthens, showcasing the timeless themes of loyalty, survival, and redemption that are at the heart of all great Western stories. The raw beauty of the landscape and the struggles of the characters intertwine, creating an unforgettable tale that captures the spirit of the frontier. In the end, they find peace not in isolation, but in the partnership they've forged, proving that even in the toughest of times, the connection between two people can offer hope and strength. This journey is a tribute to the courage and resilience found in the best Western stories, where personal transformation and survival go hand in hand with the land they roam. As they move forward, their adventure becomes a testament to the enduring power of trust and companionship, echoing the themes of freedom and the untamed spirit of the West, deeply rooted in Western stories.